Good afternoon, and welcome everyone. My name is Arpat Kovac, and I'm an assistant curator in the Department of Photographs here at the Getty Museum, and am one of the presenting curators, along with my colleague Maisie Harris, of the exhibition Dawoud Bey and Carrie Mae Weems in Dialogue. Before going any further, I want to acknowledge our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino and Tongva peoples. Getty recognizes and is committed to undertaking the work to build relationships with these communities. Just a bit of housekeeping. For those tuning into this conversation via Zoom, closed captioning has been enabled. To access live captioning, click the CC icon on the Zoom menu bar. Also, the chat function for Zoom has been enabled. Please submit questions to the panelists through the Q&A feature on the Zoom menu bar. Dawoud Bey and Carrie Mae Weems in Dialogue, on view starting today through July 9th, brings together for the first time a focused selection of work for a period of over 40 years by two of today's most important and influential artists. Each grapples with issues of race, class, and representation in their work, making art grounded in the experiences and realities of Black Americans, while also speaking to the broader human condition. It is on this occasion that we gather for today's conversation between the two artists and Dr. LeRonn Brooks, Associate Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art at the Getty Research Institute. Dawoud Bey and Carrie Mae Weems in Dialogue was organized by the Grand Rapids Art Museum, with presenting support generously provided by MillerKnoll. Additional support is provided by the Wege Foundation, Agnes Gund, the National Endowment for the Arts, and Eenhoorn LLC. The presentation and community programming in Los Angeles are made possible with major support from Jordan Schnitzer and the Harold and Arlene Schnitzer Care Foundation. Generous support has also been provided by Megan and Peter Shernan. Additional support has been provided by Jan and Trish DeBont. Dawoud Bey was born in New York City and began his career as a photographer in 1975 with a series of photographs titled Harlem, USA, that were later exhibited in his first solo exhibition at the Studio Museum in Harlem in 1979. He is known for making evocative work about communities that are often marginalized, and for exploring the histories of Black communities and its people. His street scenes and intimate portraits have been exhibited worldwide at institutions such as the Art Institute of Chicago, the Barbican Center in London, and the Whitney Museum of American Art, among many others. His photographs are in numerous public and private collections in this country and abroad. His critical writings on photography and contemporary art have appeared in many publications and exhibition catalogs. Bey is the recipient of fellowships from the MacArthur Foundation, the Guggenheim Foundation, and the National Endowment for the Arts, among others. He holds a Bachelor of Fine Arts from the School of Visual Arts in New York and a Master of Fine Arts from Yale University. He is currently professor of art at Columbia College, where he has taught since 1998. Over the last 40 years, Carrie Mae Weems has made work that has investigated family relationships, cultural identity, sexism, class, political systems, and the consequences of power in a variety of media. While primarily using photographs, she often employs text, fabrics, audio, installation, and video in her practice. Weems has also participated in numerous solo and group exhibitions, including at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, the Frist Center for Visual Art in Nashville, and the Solomon Guggenheim Museum in New York, among many others. Her work is represented in numerous private and public collections around the world. She received the Bachelor of Fine Arts degree from the California Institute of the Arts and a Master of Fine Arts in Photography from the University of California, San Diego, along with a Master of Arts in Folklore from the University of California, Berkeley. Weems has received numerous awards, grants, and fellowships, including the prestigious Prix de Rome, the National Endowment for the Arts, and a MacArthur Fellowship. She holds honorary degrees from the California College of Arts, Colgate University, Bowdoin College, the School of Visual Arts, and Syracuse University. Please help me welcome Dawoud Bey, Carrie Mae Weems, and my colleague, Dr. LeRonn Brooks.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for coming. I just want to say thank you to the Getty Museum for hosting the conversation and then hosting the exhibition in dialogue. And it's an honor to be with two people I hold in the highest esteem as friends, as artists, Carrie Mae Weems, Dawoud Bey. So we'll begin.
Thank you.
Let's start at the beginning.
Absolutely.
Let's start at the beginning, all right?
Uh-oh.
Here we see these two young folk here, 1977. You meet in the late 70s in New York at the Studio Museum in Harlem.
On that floor in the Studio Museum in Harlem. On that very floor.
On that very floor. Now, what did it mean in this particular moment in the 1970s, right? You had basically a lot going on in New York in terms of artist groups, but also there's also a history of protests going on, right? And so the Whitney, 1971, you had protests at the Whitney. You had an older generation of artists before you who were deeply involved in sort of political activism, trying to open up museums, trying to open up the art world, trying to make it more equitable in a sense to have different voices, and particularly black voices in their collections and in their galleries. And here you two are at the Studio Museum in Harlem. You meet, right, at this crucial moment. What was happening in terms of artist groups, in terms of the environment in New York at that particular time?
Oh my God.
Well, it's an interesting and layered question. Partially because, just to back up slightly, the Studio Museum in Harlem's formation is a direct outgrowth of those protests that were launched against institutions like the Metropolitan Museum, the Museum of Modern Art, the Whitney. The Studio Museum in Harlem was actually formed by the junior council of the Museum of Modern Art, ironically enough, along with other African-American artists and culture workers. And you ask what was happening at that moment. I came of age. I came up in that community of artists in New York. It was a community that was made up of artists, painters, photographers, dancers, poets, musicians, and we were all deeply engaged in each other's practices. We all showed up at each other's events. We all supported each other. We all knew what each other was doing. Ironically enough, in the pre-internet age, which means that we were very connected. There were very conversations going on.
We were very social. It was a dynamic time. I was actually really living between San Francisco and New York. Somehow, as a kid, I had figured out how to live bi-coastally very early, right? And so I was working in both cities, moving between both cities, knowing that it was important to be in New York because there was something that was happening in New York that wasn't happening in any other place, right? There was this sort of, deep group of people that were working, whether we're talking about, Ntozake Shange and David Murray. David Murray is going to be performing actually this evening, which is really fantastic to be able to be working with David tonight, 50 years after really meeting him in New York. So it was this really amazing time. And if anything was happening, if any major question arose, right? If a new novel came out and it needed to be discussed, for instance, like Michelle Wallace's Black Macho and Myth of the Superwoman, right? I mean, these were conversations where hundreds of artists would gather at the Studio Museum to hash it out, right? And so at that moment, very much similar and different from this moment, right? We knew all of the artists that were in our environment, right? We knew all of the artists that were in our environment, many of the serious artists that were in our environment. Now, of course, I know very few of the artists that are working today, right? There's a whole new generation of dynamic artists that are coming along that I don't know, who I need to know, and I'm excited to know them, right? But just as we sort of encountered protests, demonstrations, a reckoning that gave rise to the Studio Museum, right? We are also in the midst of a reckoning now, right? The death of George Floyd, the straw that broke the camel's back, set something in motion that had been sluggishly moving along, right? And suddenly, this death occurs that sends millions of people around the world into the street. And institutions, museums, universities consider now who they are and consider what it means then to welcome in another layer of humanity in order to deal with the profundity of its own, right? That you cannot actually leave out a vast majority of humankind and expect to be expressive of the humanity of who we are as complex beings and as a multi-dimensional complex society. So we are sort of experiencing, once again, on a different level, right? On a different level, but not really different circumstances.
Yeah, and we were living in the aftermath of the late 60s. We were coming of age in the late 60s, meeting up at some of the institutions that were formed in the aftermath of that moment as well. Studio Museum in Harlem, Cinque Gallery, Reusse Gallery. There was a very real impetus for Black artists and Black cultural workers to seize the moment and create the spaces that we needed that didn't exist. And it wasn't, the painters just didn't go to things that painters did. Photographers didn't just go. It was a community that was very diverse in terms of the practices. Now, when she talks about knowing all the artists, we knew all of the artists, both who were our contemporaries, but also the ones from the previous generation. We knew them. We had conversations with them. And we were also aware that we were operating within a space of responsibility to bring that history forward in some way, with the same degree of rigor that had inspired us to get involved in the first place.
We were sort of, I think, Dawoud was my teacher. This is very important to know. Dawoud was one of my first teachers. And we were both in our 20s. We were at the Studio Museum. I had gone to the Studio Museum and I wanted to take classes there. And Dawoud was one of my first teachers on the East Coast.
I was teaching photography classes.
Right, so I've been following him ever since, unfortunately. Right, he's still a better photographer. I'm still trying to outdo him, but always playing.
I hadn't even been doing it that long, but I've been looking at a lot of work. I've been looking at, I was regularly looking at work at Marlborough Gallery, anywhere that the thing was happening that I thought I wanted to do. I was really steeping myself in that. But in terms of knowing from actual practice, I knew more from reading history, looking at the objects.
Yes.
And the Studio Museum in Harlem knew the beginnings of the work that I was doing that became Harlem, USA. And Janet Henry, who is now a close friend of both of us, was running the education department at Studio Museum in Harlem after Linda Bryant left to start just above Midtown. I mean, there's so many byways in the history. And then the first day of class, this woman who is my contemporary, she
And I was
showed
really
up.
cute.
And I still remember your words. You know, you had your Leica camera in your hand. She was very shy, kind of going back and forth between looking at the floor and looking at me. And she said, "Hi, my name is Carrie Mae Weems." And then she stopped. I said, "Yes." She said, "Do you think I could be a photographer?" Now, what did I know? This was the first time I was teaching the class. But I knew that the right thing to do was to say, "Of course, come in, let's get to work."
Of that moment, though, you said, "But then came Carrie to the Studio Museum, and she not only made me a better teacher from the first day, but began to reveal her own deep intelligence that appeared to be looking for a vehicle."
Absolutely. You know, whenever I said that, it was true, because she was deeply intelligent. She just needed a way to attach that intelligence to a particular medium. You've been involved in dance prior to that. It wasn't like you didn't have expressive forms. That was my sense of it anyway. I don't even know to this day exactly
Where she came
how Studio Museum in Harlem got on your radar and how you came to be standing in that doorway.
I think, you know, how many art students are out there? Art students, people studying photography, right? Artists, painters, musicians, right? So there are many, many artists here and people that are deeply interested and invested in the arts. And all of your life, you will be asking yourself the same question, right? Who am I, and what is this thing that I am so passionate about, and where can it take me, and where can I take it? What is my voice? What is my voice in this thing? No matter whether you're a writer or a musician, or what is my voice in this thing? What is its specific utterance, right? What makes me who I am, and how does that fit in the grand scheme of things? And how do I change this thing that I'm involved in? How do I enlarge the field by my presence and by the questions that I ask of myself and of the field that I'm involved in, right? And so this question is my galvanizing, motivating, overarching question that I wake up with constantly in relationship to everything that I do, right? In terms of the way that I live my life. What is my question? What is my voice? How do I enlarge the field? How do I engage it? And how do I push, right? Open at the boundaries to make something new happen? And I think that, coming to that early, knowing that I wanted to be an artist early, right? I wasn't exactly sure early on if I was going to be a dancer or a photographer or a geneticist for that matter, right? But I knew that there was something about creative capacity that was very important to the who and what of myself. And I think that in a lot of ways that was then therefore the deepest connection between Dawoud and I, because I think that we were asking ourselves sort of deep questions about who we were as artists, and what the field needed, and how to address that field in a very specific way, not only as makers, but as intellectuals involved in the field, as teachers, as mentors, as guides, as collaborators. And so for me, I think it's been just as important to do my own work as it has been to really think about what needs to happen within the field of photography, and by extension, the visual arts, and by extension, then, how do we negotiate and understand museums and these sorts of practices, and how do we, in insist that these organizations and institutions then change in order to reflect something that's more dynamic. And so it all, from this seed, from this body, then sort of pours forth all of this other information and idea that I think is just as important.
And from that seed of intention, I'm looking out at the audience, and I'm seeing one of the biggest, most diverse audiences I've ever seen from my standpoint. The line of the cars to get to the museum was backed up to the road. And a lot of that is because institutions, especially this exhibition, is the kind of exhibition that attracts people who need it. And we need it because it reflects, for me, it reflects me. It was sort of I saw their work in the library, right? And luckily, I got a chance to sort of, at some particular point, meet them. But I found their work in a gallery at the Studio Museum before I even met them, as an intern, before I even met them. And so to be here and to recognize what institutions can do, right, when we challenge them to do so, right, is really what it's about in a certain way, because you two are both the descendants of people who challenge these spaces, right? And your work existing in these spaces right now is sort of the success of that generation, but what does that actually mean, right? But Carrie, you mean intention. And so you were a dancer, you were a drummer, right? And so you two have particular sets of skills that go into, that in some particular way, melds into your artistic practice. Dawoud, you mentioned rigor, right? Being a jazz musician. And Carrie, you practicing dance and having a more of a sort of dynamic sense of movement, coming from having studied that. I mean, I think both of that sort of feeds into your work. And so, Dawoud, how does rigor and being a pianist,
drummer,
a jazz drummer, mean?
Well, my whole sense of what it means to be an artist was shaped by my early drum teachers, both in terms of the rigor of practice, and we were talking earlier, when musicians talk about practice, they're not talking about this thing that people toss around now, I have an art practice. When musicians talk about practice, they really mean you have to practice. And the musicians that I respected basically practiced from the moment they woke up. Maybe they took a break to go to the bathroom and eat, but they were rigorously practicing. And also practicing within the context of a deep knowledge of the history of the form that they were practicing. So for me, that was formative, this notion of rigorous practice, integrity, intention, and being deeply steeped in the history of the form that you're practicing. And that's what we both had in common.
Yeah.
We were deeply interested in the history of people who had made photographs, and in the history of the photographic medium. And we would go out to look at photographs, whether it was Robert Frank, Henry Cartier-Bresson, Brassard, Roy DiCaravo was there for us.
They were all
as an example, who was a little closer because he was the only African-American photographer operating within that milieu. But we were just deeply interested in photography, looking at, learning about, talking about the capacities that photography has as a medium, and then having absorbed that, what might we bring to that?
Yeah.
What might we add to that? What might we do to very intentionally move that forward?
Yeah. But it's interesting because I spent a lot of time organizing photographers. So I really started my little career as a photographer. Yes, I was making pictures, but of course I was deeply interested in what Black photographers were doing, the Wege workshop, and some of the other groups that were actually forming also here in LA, which is very important. Very different groups, but very important groups nonetheless. I was organizing women photographers, right? You know, as a young person, I went to Cal Arts here. So I wanted to know, I mean, I would go to the library and there were maybe two or three books about women in photography, right? So I actually, you know, started, you know, I had my little work-study job, and I made a flyer and calling on women photographers to send me their work, right? 10 slides each, right? So every week I would get my paycheck and I'd buy another book of stamps and send out another batch of flyers all over, collecting materials, collecting ideas, and starting my own sort of little archive of who were the women that were out there working in the world. Who were the Black artists that were out there working in the world that I needed to know? So I actually did all of that work. I actually still have many of those slides, right? I have like, you know, racks and racks of slides by any number of young photographers or photographers that I was discovering for the first time, and one of them was Deborah Willis. The way that I met Deborah Willis was that she sent me her slides when she was a young student, and I put her in an exhibition at Brockman Gallery. It was her first show. So that's really, you know, so that a lot of the work is the work, right? A lot of the work is, what do I do for me? Because I'm deeply selfish. I'm deeply committed to my own practice, deeply committed to my own work. But then what do I really do for the field as well? And how do I engage that field in such a way that I understand the context in which I'm situated? And so doing that work has been very important, and I actually continue to do that work now. If I do a major exhibition somewhere, often it's followed by or in conjunction with a large convening or a symposium that I put together that is around contemporary issues that interest me, and I invite in musicians and artists and dancers and poets and choreographers. LeRonn was actually a part of the last one that I did at the Park Avenue Armory. So this is a part, I think, of my practice, and I think it has to do both with being, you know, deeply curious, but it also has to do with being a woman. I think that women often function in a way as caretakers, and we are the caretakers of our field in a very unique way.
Yeah. Yeah, please. Please. You know, hearing you, Carrie, it brings to mind how you're artists, but you have to be more than artists. That generationally, some of the artists that we respect, we see in history books, were also mentors to many, many, many different people. It's really profound that you would love to concentrate just on your work in the studio or in the street, but you also have to have this other part. You also have to have this investment in the next generation because of the necessity. Because if the schools aren't doing it, if there aren't professors that encourage students, then the students have to get it from somewhere, right? And that you may have many mentors alongside of the brilliant work that you're doing. What is that? What is that like?
Yeah, you know, that's what has kept me teaching as long as I have, some 40 years now. You know, because teaching for me is really not only about teaching, but about mentoring, about example setting, about bringing a history into the room that is really my history. And if I'm not in the room, the fullness of that history is not there. And also because the generation of artists before me took me in a very, you know, active way. You know, Lou Draper, one of the Camongue photographers, he would invite me to, do you have any new work? Put it in a box. Meet me in the luncheonette at such and such on the Upper West Side. I want to see what you're doing. You don't have to do that.
Yeah, he was so...
But he did, and because he did, I do that.
Yeah.
That was the kind of, you know, intergenerational community, you know, that we came up in.
Yeah.
They were interested in what we were doing. They were encouraging it, whether formally as Deacon Robert did from the classroom, or informally, the way Lou Draper and others in that group did. Jimmy Manis, names that you wouldn't even know, but who are the people who preceded me. Jimmy Manis was another photographer in Camonga. He went to see my Harlem, USA exhibition and said, "Meet me at Mike's Deli tomorrow at 9:30. Mike's was a very well-known deli in the Clinton Hill section of Brooklyn where we both lived. And he began to ask me some really deep questions about the exhibition. He was the first photographer who actually had a very critical conversation with me about my work. And I remember he said, "You're a formalist." I didn't realize you were a formalist. You're a formalist who's working, with the African-American subject. I said, well, form is important. The whole form content thing, maybe that conversation is still present, but there's the thing that you're making work about, and then there's the form, that's the container of that thing. And the first time I had to articulate that to someone who was not challenging me on it, but questioning it, was when Jimmy Manis took me to breakfast and wanted me to talk about my notions of formalism in photography. So, the fact of what that did for me and what conversations with any number of other older artists, because it wasn't just photographers. I spent a lot of time in Ed Clark's studio, a lot of time out in Mel Edwards' studio. And I hope you know some of these names. Ed Clark, African-American, second-generation abstractionist from the 10th Street days in New York. Mel Edwards, still an extraordinary sculptor. William T. Williams. They were all mentors who became friends, who kind of defined for me what it meant to be an artist and to practice rigorously. And then we could also have that conversation about what it meant to be a black artist and practice rigorously within the context and the shape of a larger history.
Well, I think we were talking earlier about Dawoud. I think that there needs to be like a great oral history just with Dawoud and Dawoud's expansive community, the people that you were working with, how you were working with them. But I do want to say something, because I do think that it's important. Men and women do really have different relationships in the world. In the way that women work in the world and the way that men work in the world is very different. And this is, if you noticed, all of the people that Dawoud just named were men. There were no women involved in that. Now, this is not a criticism of Dawoud, right, or of the men who are working. It's simply like an observation. And so, as a woman, it meant that, I had to do like some other kinds of things in order to get my work done, right? I was not taken in the same way that Dawoud was taken in by these men. No men invited me for breakfast to have a conversation about the nature of my work or my philosophical beliefs.
And if they invited you, it might have been about something else.
Right, exactly. Usually it was.
Really? No,
and usually I didn't mind.
It's interesting.
But we got to get real about what this is. You know what I'm saying?
Whenever I was in the vicinity of 23rd Street and 5th Avenue in Manhattan, Ed Clark's studio was on 22nd and 5th. So whenever I was on 23rd, I would say, okay, let me drop by and see if Ed's there and just see what he's working on. And it was very interesting because my former wife is a painter who knew Ed Clark. And she said, you were lucky. I could not just ring his bell in the middle of the day uninvited.
That's right. That's right. That's right. So it is a different...
Yeah, what would that mean? A woman rings your bell uninvited
it's a
in the middle
reality,
of the
and
day.
It still matters.
It could become something else among the guys that stayed where it was supposed to. That was a very, real issue.
Yeah. I mean, I think what it means now is that, just being aware of how you can work. Just being aware of how you work and what the constraints might be I think it is really important, even as things appear to be opening up. We're still living, as Amiri Baraka would say, within the changing sane, right? That there are these things, these patterns of power that really need to be negotiated and understood if we're actually to really get our work done. But I also never, let it distract me too much. It's sort of like you understand what the circumstances are, but then you continue to do the work, right? Because ultimately, it is the work. It is the work, and I'm deeply committed to the work.
And so, Carrie, the kitchen table series. Now, this world exists, but it's a very intimate world, right? But just noting what you two were saying, just in terms of the gender politics.
Yeah,
right?
I think that's true.
The
Absolutely.
gender politics.
Yeah.
Can you speak about like how this could have been is informed by gender politics?
Well, completely. I mean, and very interestingly, in many ways, women have often worked in their homes. The vast majority of women photographers have all worked in their homes. They all used home as a site of exploration. Whereas for the most part, very few men, I can think of Dwayne Michaels right off the top, but I really can't think of like a lot of men off the top who actually use home as a site of exploration, right? This sort of site of domesticity, and how to unpack domesticity was at the heart of the kitchen table series, right? And but it follows a long line of women who were working in a very similar way, differently, but again using the home as that sort of site of exploration. So then, if you're going to do that, right? If home is the space, then how do you then carefully unpack it according to the rules and the game that's being played contemporarily? So ideas about, the feminist critique of the world. Feminism was on the rise. We were talking about ideas about representation. All those things were really at the core of producing something like the Kitchen Table series. And it was the culmination of a lot of thinking around representation, around women, and around the family, and how to unpack that.
And so, as an extension of Dawoud's the quote I read about from Dawoud, this is in line, like finding your voice in the world, finding your creative voice in the world, and pulling together your own experiences. It's sort of what you both have done, right? Pulling together those things that you didn't, that are from you, that move you to make work, right? And so, on the one hand, you have documentation, right? The idea of documenting environment, documenting neighborhoods, but the intimacy of this particular image actually informed me as a man in terms of the beauty of the of relationships between. So it's also an education.
Oh, great.
It's also an education. And I'm thinking, maybe, well, I'm not going to go there. But it's also an education, right?
Kitchen Table actually started with a man. The first photograph I made in the space was with a man. And, it was a space that I'd set up. It was my kitchen, right? And it had this light. And every day I would sort of pass it. And I started to sort of think about it. And then I started inviting people in to sit at my table, right? And looking at them through this device of my life. Right? And how to think about that. But the first image was of a man, and the text read, Jim, the mission, if you choose to accept, is to land on your own 2 feet.
That's in the gallery, yeah. So what's also there is structure, and you both are really, really strong with the kinds of compositions that you place your figures in. And so, we can start here, then we're going to go back to Dawoud, that triangle. For me, it's a deeply Renaissance, right? The composition of especially this photograph goes back thousands of years, just in terms of the way structure and geometry works. And so, this could be a Renaissance frieze if it was carved out of marble. The way that the triangle just goes, or the different kinds of structures. And so you have the narrative, right, that fits the kinds of communication you want to be in the world, and the kinds of identities the kinds of people you want to like embolden and hearten, right? But the structure of it brings it across. Dawoud, what do you think about structure? As in terms of rigor, right? Rigor and structure, how do these two things go together for you?
Rigor and structure, well, I think one of the things that making photographs or making, in a different way of thinking about it, two-dimensional work. Work that sits on the flat two-dimensional surface. How does one give that some dimensionality?
Yeah.
How does one give that a kind of resonance, you know, that allows the object to move from being merely photographic experience to experience, where the work is more deeply felt and taken to heart, you know, within the either, as with the kitchen table series, square or rectangular format that we are confined to, you know. So for me, the rigor has to do with being inventive enough to continually reinvent that space. That's rigor. That's rigor, to continually reinvent that space, you know, and remain consistent in intention, and maybe even in narrative, but to continue to explore and expand, really, the shape of the work. Now, that's part of the rigor. The other rigor is in the making of it, and the making of the objects that, you know, an audience will come to see and experience. How does one willfully manipulate the materials, in this case of the photographic medium, to make something that is, I guess on one level, seductive enough materially to want you to engage with this beautifully made object.
Yeah.
You know, and it's not going to happen just because you put this here and this there. You know, it's the use of the materials, the intentional, you know, use of materials to make that object such that it seduces the viewer to want to engage with it. And then once they engage with it, the deeper part of the narrative begins to take hold. So it's all about being knowledgeable about one's materials, one's form.
There's also, you know, it goes back to that sort of idea about rigor of, you know, of just constantly working. You know, that you have an understanding of, you know, the formal dimensions, right? We are developed in the West, most of us, right? You know, we understand a tradition. We understand the traditions that we function within. We're not simply making in isolation, right? And so, you know, you've studied art, you've studied, you know, painting, you've studied, you know, photography, you've studied you studied music, right? And you bring all of these ideas and understandings of pattern and form and dimensionality and plasticity and et cetera to the work. Kitchen table, you know, I would photograph in the morning, in the noon, and the night. You don't have to shift back and forth. It's fine, right? You know, but you know, I would make photographs morning, noon, and night. I'd go to my dark room, I'd develop my film, I'd make my contact sheets, I'd look at them, what was wrong with that picture, what didn't sit right with that. I'd go back and I'd make it again, I'd make my prints. That didn't work, I'd tear those up, I'd go back and I'd make it again. That didn't work, I'd go back and, right? You know, I mean, it was a real, like this push. I mean, it was like, you know, I was working my ass off, right? You know, I'm trying to figure this thing out. And right, out of the hundreds of photographs that were made, you know, there were maybe 15, maybe 10 that are really fabulous, that are bigger than me. And I think that for me as an artist, that's when I'm really excited about the work, when the work actually then is bigger than me. When I'm surprised, it was like, oh. Oh.
Yeah.
There it is. There it is, right? You know, that's the thing that I've been searching for. That's the thing.
And what it takes
that's been
to get there.
And what it takes.
You know, and that's the rigor. And it's because I've been teaching for a very long time, you know, the thing that has most frustrated me, because it is so central to how one gets there, is making a suggestion to a student to do this very same thing that you described. Go back and make it again. But this time, stand here. This time, do that. This time, don't make the light so hot. Put it in a soft box. Maybe put it off to the right or the left to give it some of that Caravaggio, you know, some of that emotional quality of light. And they don't do it. They move on to the next thing. You know? But those are the things, you know, when I was making portraits, you know, that was always one of my measures in terms of not just the subject, what they were about, but how to vary the emotional and psychological range. And when I would play with the light, it was like giving it more or less Caravaggio. You know, because Caravaggio, if you know Caravaggio's paintings, the drama of that single, you know, light source of that work, it just heightens the drama of the paintings. And I'm not a painter, but that's something I needed to know.
Yeah, and that is studied. When we say, you know, Caravaggio, I mean, that's a deep investment in the history of what you're doing, right? The history of, even though he's a painter, in the history of what art is, right? If this is what you want to do professionally, right? Not even just professionally, but if that's what you choose to do.
Just the making. I mean, I think that, you know, it's like this proximity, you know, of, I'm not sure if it's like, for me, it feels like you're trying to just get as close as you can to the truth, as you understand it. You know, what is the truth, as I understand it, and how do I use everything that I know, all that is within me, to bring that truth to light, so that we can actually share in it and then have a conversation, right? So what do I need to do as the artist? How deep do I need to go as the artist? How deep can I go as the artist? And how do I then allow you, Jamel, to have a conversation with me and with yourself through the thing that I've made, right? And how much then does it reflect not only my experience, but your experience, right? And if I can connect with you, right, if I can bring you to your own experience through me, then we are in serious communication with one another. There's no more sort of division between us. We are in this thing together. And I think that that's ultimately what you strive for, and what it means then when the work is actually bigger than yourself. And that lesson, again, of how do you get out of the way of the work? You know, how do you get out of the way of the work so that the work can really do the work it needs to do for you, right? How do you do that? And I think that it does take an enormous amount of energy. It takes an enormous amount of sacrifice. It takes an enormous amount of work, and it takes an enormous amount of patience. And I think it's the work that you actually work on through the course of your life. It doesn't stop at any given moment. It's a thing that you're always working toward.
And I think it's important, too, because there are a number of young artists here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is to have work that you aspire to make something that for you resonates as much as that work does. So to have some kind of benchmark of aspiration. And you know, Roy DeCarava was, in a very absolute sense,
for both of us,
photographer. He was that for me. And the work in this exhibition, Night Coming Tenderly Black,
is a tribute.
It wouldn't have existed without Roy DeCarava, quite frankly. Without Roy DeCarava, and probably John Coltrane, A Love Supreme, as one of the formal structural, and with Roy, material influences.
Yeah. For those of you who don't know, you should really look up Roy DeCarava. He was really one of the great masters of contemporary photography, and many people don't know who he is, but he was a gift and died not too long ago. But really an amazing photographer who he was as important to American photography as Robert Frank and Walker Evans are to American photography.
Absolutely. And he was hugely important to both of us. But for me, Roy was important not only because of the thing that he made work about, which was largely
his family,
the black subject, but how he manipulated and used
material
and transformed the material of photography to talk about that, to use the medium as an expressive form and
to talk about blackness,
materiality, to devise a material language for talking about the black subject.
Yeah, it's fabulous. His book, The Sweet Fly Paper of Life, is really one of the great books. And a few years ago, when I was living here, I was driving through. I've been searching for The Sweet Fly Paper of Life for a long time, right? It had been out of print for a long time. It only really came into being because of Langston Hughes. Langston Hughes writing the text for it. Langston just sort of did it and gave it to Roy, like, here's your book. So it was really wonderful. Simon & Schuster printed it. And so one afternoon, I'm driving through South Central LA, and there's a little bookstore, and I decided to swing into the bookstore. And I walked in, I was cocky, I had my little handbag, and I said, I'm looking for the copy of Sweet Fly Paper of Life. Would you happen to have a copy? And she said, yeah, baby, I got about 5 or 6 copies back there.
How about that?
She had 5 copies of the Sweet Fly Paper of Life, and she was selling them for $4.95.
How about that?
It was I was just unbelievable.
Do y'all mind if I read a quote by Roy DeCarava? Okay. I want to extend the boundaries of the literalness of the image and make it mine. Make it more personal, more what you feel than what it is. What we feel is very subjective, and the idea is to use the medium, even though it has the quality of being what it is, but to use it to make it your own. Right?
To push through what it is.
That's right.
Make it your own.
Yeah.
To push through the presumed limitations of what it is.
Right.
But that's what musicians do. Every tenor saxophone player is playing the same instrument, but it doesn't sound the same. And none of them sounded like John Coltrane, who completely transformed that instrument, into a very different kind of expressive voice.
Yeah.
They're all playing the same instrument,
right.
and that's true for musicians in general. Tony Williams doesn't sound like Philly Joe Jones, who doesn't sound like Nasheed Waite. They're playing the same instrument.
Yeah, right. I think that's the whole thing about finding voice, finding the nature of your voice and being able to understand its utterance, to understand what it is, understand its uniqueness. Really the thing that makes you. It's just sort of baffling to me that, that I'm touching this chair and I can leave it and 100 years from now you can come back and you can sense, you can touch, and you can know that through my DNA that I was here. That I was here, right? And so we are unique and we are always present. And so how do you then use voice in order to voice the essence of you and who you are, and to really tap into that without fear and without shame, but without trepidation? And, I'll just say this because I know that we have to wrap up soon. I've had, a couple of really, a couple of wonderful guides and guideposts and mentors along the way. Wege Foundation was probably the first man that I know seriously, who took me seriously as an artist. And when he decided that he needed someone to step in for him to teach at Hunter College, he asked me to do it, which I said, "This is Carrie Mae Weems that you're calling." And but it was really kind of wonderful and very important that Wege Foundation recognized me as a person that could stand in for him. That was sort of enormous in my life. But the other person that has really stood with me for over 45 years and has guided me and has been a great mentor and a great, great, great friend is a man named Dawoud Bey. And so I really want to thank you.
Thank you.
For your love and for your commitment and for your friendship.
Thank you. I can't kiss you from here to there, but I'm kissing you. I want to say something about this photograph before we wrap up, because I think it gives a sense of the nature of our particular conversation. And I was reminded of this particular piece of it only because Ron Platt, the curator, where are you, Ron?
Ron is
there
here.
You go. And Ron selected this photograph of Carrie Mae for inclusion in the early work section of the exhibition. And when the show first opened in Grand Rapids, at the Grand Rapids Art Museum, I looked at this photograph, and you see a man on the left in a light-colored shirt and a cap. He's standing in what was a stairwell that he improvised into an outdoor store, and he would sell little items. And I saw the photograph, and I said, Carrie, that man is in one of my Harlem, USA photographs. And she said, of course, don't you remember? You were standing next to me when I made that picture. I actually didn't remember, but I just, because that image is on the screen right now, I just had to. That was the nature of our conversation.
I mean, so for me, that represents the fabric of the kinds of relationships, and you are different people, but the kinds of relationships that sustain us over the years, right? So you can say it about art, but it's about life. It's about life, and it's about also, again, intention to stay in each other's lives, right? And so to say that you've been friends for over 4 decades should not be taken lightly at all, you know? And yes. So I just want to acknowledge that. I guess in the time we have left, are there any questions from the audience?
There's a question over here. There's a question over there. But it's nice to see Ron and, and also the wonderful designer of our catalog who's here. Can you guys just stand for a moment so that we can just give you a round of applause and thank you? Also, comments are acceptable too.
First of all, thank you. All three of you. This is, as a young Black artist, this is phenomenal to see. There's a bunch of contemporary design in here, and I get to see all of this experiences at one exact time. So thank you, seriously, for setting this up. You spoke to it very briefly, Ms. Weems, about your relationship to the darkroom, and you both spoke about how you maneuvered your work as a woman and as a man. I'm curious to know what your relationship was with the darkroom over the course of your career, and curious to know if there were any kinds of. Thank you. Gotcha. If there were, what's up, y'all? Y'all good? If there were any particular approaches to your work in the darkroom specific to you being a woman and specific to you being a man, and over the longevity of your both careers.
I'm not so sure. I think that, at a certain point, it all gets down to mechanics, right? They're just simply the mechanics of working. And so, for years we were, black and white photographers, and we developed our film, and we made our own prints, right? And there's you know, so I didn't really see any huge difference in that way. I think it's much more social. It's the way in which the work is understood, and the way in which men and women are generally embraced socially as artists. And those, it's still pretty much the same. And of course, you know, for Black women, it's a little daunting, right? And there's been a lot of work more recently about the ways in which the work of Black women artists is historically valued. It is always undervalued, just as Black women are historically undervalued. So that's something that you are aware of. I don't allow it to shift what I'm doing, but rather to the extent that I'm aware of it, to the extent that it really matters, I need to put it in the work. That I need to put it in the work and have that be another level and layer of the work, but not allow it to, with my capacity to build.
Yeah, and I think, you know, we are also both, we came into this and we were products of the time that we came into this. And we've certainly, over the 4 decades that we've continued making work, have been aware of how that context has changed, both in terms of conceptually, in terms of what we're able to draw from conceptually, but also materially. Because when we started making photographs, I guess 11 by 14 was large. 16 by 20 print
was
16
huge.
by 20 print was very large.
Right.
And if you built a darkroom big enough, you could make a 20 by 24.
Yeah.
And so the whole sense of scale
Has changed.
in terms of how photography has changed as an object that holds the wall,
Yeah.
we're obviously very conscious of that.
Mm-hmm.
And the work in this exhibition gives a very good sense of our being aware that the context in which we make work and in which we show work is changing. And we've both been very responsive to that. The kind of, you know, the size of work that we were making when we started in certain contexts, especially, you know, the way the architecture of museums has grown. Some of that work would look like a postage stamp on the wall now, which is not something that you want. So there has to, you know, you make your work out of a set of really self-interested intentions, but you also have to be very aware of how the field and the context around you is kind of reshaping your work, and figure out a way to, with real integrity, respond to that.
Well, maybe one more question and then. Yep.
Oh,
Yep.
I'm curious about, about this photograph in particular, were you just walking down the street, always walking through the streets of New York, carrying your
Yes.
camera, and you said, this is a photograph, and you stopped and took it? Or did you pose these people?
Yeah, it was just a scene that I happened across. There was a little street fair that was actually happening on the street that day, which is why Dawoud and I actually were there. I think it was on 127th Street or 126th Street.
Yeah, either 127th or West 132nd.
Right.
I don't remember.
Yeah, so we were just out photographing. It's not posed at all, but it looks like it's an amazing little photograph, and it's just, you know, just this big. I really love it.
All right.
So one more question, and then we will wrap up.
The
Yeah?
wrap up. Yes. Please.
I was just curious, given his question and also what you guys were saying earlier.
Okay, wait for the microphone.
Given this gentleman's question and then what you said earlier specifically about the fact that, you know, you do hundreds of photographs and then maybe 10 actually happen and come alive, or what you said about asking your students to go back to redo the lighting to be more like a Caravaggio or whatever that is. So is there a major difference, do you think, for younger photographers today using primarily digital versus film, and does that change those aha moments?
No.
Somehow or not?
It really doesn't change the aha moment. You know, yesterday I was with a photographer. She must have made like 5,000 photographs. It was like, why? Why? You know, I mean, there's like no discipline there. There's no discipline there. And I think that, you know, I mean, in some ways, that's sort of like the danger of digital photography, you know, and also your iPhone, right? So you're just clicking and clicking and clicking and clicking and clicking, and you never even look at them. You know, you don't even go back to study them, right? It's just like noise. It's like something for you to do. Do you know what I mean? You know? But I actually turn off my phone as much as I possibly can. And I probably make a few more photographs. I make a few more photographs absolutely because I have a digital camera. But I really try to be a stickler about it. You know, like I don't make 1,000 photographs of a thing. You know, I make a few photographs of a thing, maybe 10 more, 15 more than I ordinarily would. But I'm still pretty rigorous about it because I don't have time to waste. I'm working, right? I'm working and I'm trying to really make something that is meaningful and that matters. And a part of that is being really rigorous about the way that I'm looking, my physicality in relationship to the thing, my stance in relationship to the subject, my proximity to the subject. All of those things, I think, really matter, and you carry that with you into the work that you make. I think it's really, really important. I'm not interested in a lot of nonsense and a lot of garbage, right? I'm just trying to make, you know, trying to be exact, and you know, failing most of the time, but I'm still trying.
All right.
Yeah, I agree.
Thank you, everyone.
Is that it?
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you.